Thanks very much, Joe, and thank you for coming out. You're going to have a very easy time following tonight. You won't be overwhelmed by visual images. You will just have 9 quotations to follow, and I had put them on a handout. I thought that would be a good practical joke since it's so dark in here, and most people here are wearing glasses. So don't worry about that. You can treat that handout as a souvenir, and the same quotations will be up here. So if you can, the only thing about the handout is it has the numbers of the quotations so you can follow how far I am along. Here you'll just have to take my word for it. I'm very grateful to the people here who have been so good to us and our residency, Joe Lamack, Steve Webb. I'm very grateful to Frank and Linda Laux as well, and thank you for coming. I'm going to be talking about Mark Twain and the Civil War memoir boom, and I'm taking my particular sample of the boom from a handful of generals who penned their memoirs, which were printed by New York publishers between 1874 and 1888. And quite conveniently, you'll know that those are also the years during which Twain and his family were spending the summer here. These were the last years of Reconstruction and the first years of Jim Crow, and they fell smack in the middle of what we call the Gilded Age, thanks to our friend Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner and the novel they wrote with that title in 1873. During these years, the presidents were Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James A. Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, all Republicans, and then a lone Democrat, Grover Cleveland. During these same years, veterans organizations held reunions. Towns and cities unveiled monuments. Regimental histories poured forth, and the government printing office began its 21-year mission to publish the compiled records of the American Civil War, both sides, amounting to finally 140,000 pages. If you're ever bored, that will take care of you. In approaching the memoirs, I'm especially interested in 3 things, and you can relax because I will signal each one as it comes up again. I'm interested in 1, the relation of the memoirs to the post-war publishing industry and the early Civil War book market. I'm interested in 2, the relations between and among memory, imagination, history, and literature. Those terms are not interchangeable, but they do overlap. And I'm interested, 3, in the relations between audience expectations and all of these first-person narratives using the personal pronoun I. So let's set the scene, and let's be clear right off the bat. Generals did not invent personal narratives or the memoir genre. Appearing as early as 1861, I found one actually dated July 1861, personal wartime narratives came from women as well as men, Southerners as well as Northerners, civilians as well as combatants, professional writers as well as amateurs. Many of the earliest narratives recounted ordeals in prisons or in hospitals. For example, there's one that was written by somebody here, Anthony M. Kiley, called In Vinculus, In Chains, or A Prisoner of War, 1866, about his experience at Elmira. Among the hospital books, probably the most famous was published by James Redpath in Boston, and that was Louisa May Alcott's Hospital Sketches, 1863. In the same year that a Boston publisher published Henry David Thoreau's Walden, 1854, it also printed, the same publisher printed Frederick Law Olmsted's Hospital Transports. Most people know Frederick Law Olmsted as the architect, landscape architect of Central Park, but he then went on and actually was the executive secretary of the United States Sanitary Commission, the forerunner of the Red Cross. An especially successful wartime book, which added cross-dressing disguise to the hospital genre, was a book by Sarah Edmonds that came to be called Nurse and Spy in the Union. And this book sold so well that 20 years later, Mark Twain would measure the sales of Ulysses S. Grant's personal memoirs against its achievement. By the time U.S. Grant wrote his own book, he was joining a memoir bonanza in full swing, one that other generals from both the loyal states and actually more often the seceding ones had joined before him. And you may know some of these names if you're interested in this area. Jubal Anderson Early, 1866, Joseph Eggleston Johnson, 1874, William Tecumseh Sherman, 1875, Richard Taylor, son of the President Zachary Taylor, 1879, and John Bell Hood in 1880. All of these people had written and published memoirs before Grant ever came along. So, in other words, the Civil War personal narrative genre was nearly 25 years old when Grant added his contribution. Anybody who has an image of generals' books dominating Civil War memory until little people like us started writing about them too is looking at a mirage. Helping to conjure that mirage was the growth and the transformation of the post-war publishing industry. And here comes now my first of three topics. So this is about the post-war publishing industry. After the Civil War, the world of print expanded rapidly. During the 1870s, when Twain and his family are coming here, the number of newspapers nearly doubled. The number of magazines doubled. The book business boomed. The price of paper dropped. It had been very expensive during the war. Mechanical typesetters sped up production. Oh dear, don't invest in one called the Page typesetter. Population increased, and so did the literacy rate. The number of public libraries grew, and it led to the founding in 1876 of the American Library Association. 1876, same year that Twain published Tom Sawyer. With greater demand for print, established publishers flourished and new ones appeared. Among the major publishers selling Civil War books during the Gilded Age were three in particular I'll talk about. D. Appleton and Company, we don't have them anymore. Charles Scribner and Company, we do still have Scribner. Harper and Brothers, we still have a descendant of Harper and Brothers. All these companies began in the North before the Civil War, and they had no equals in the antebellum South. Although the war disrupted book selling in the South, these and other northern publishers dominated the trade before the war and after. Here's what's really interesting to me. What really interests me is the way in which these northern publishers met and created demand by publishing personal narratives from both sides of the war. These are New York publishers, but they're publishing narratives from both sides of the war, and they're selling their books in both the North and the South as the number of bookstores in the former Confederate states begins to return to the pre-war level. And I'll give you examples from two of the houses. I mentioned D. Appleton and Company. Between 1865 and 1900, Appleton published books by Confederates, Joseph E. Johnston, Richard Taylor, and Walter Heron Taylor, who was a lieutenant colonel and Robert E. Lee's assistant adjutant during the campaign in Virginia, of the Army of Northern Virginia. At the same time, they covered their bets by publishing William T. Sherman, United States Admiral David Dixon Porter, and United States Brevet Brigadier General Nelson Appleton Miles. In the same way, Scribner, between 1881 and 1895, published 16 volumes in the series Campaigns of the Civil War, all authored by Northerners. But then they followed with Confederates, John B. Gordon's Reminiscences of the Civil War in 1903, and Edward Porter Alexander's Military Memoirs of a Confederate in 1907. So you get this image of them working both sides of the street. There was one big exception to this post-war pattern of publishing both sides. There was a newcomer firm founded in 1884 as a publisher by subscription, Charles L. Webster and Company. They had offices near Broadway at 658 Broadway near Bond Street, and Charles L. Webster served as the business director of the firm. which in 1891 brought out a forgotten minor novel by somebody named Matt Krim called Adventures of a Fair Rebel. I have not read it. If anybody here has, please tell me about it. Otherwise, with that one exception, Webster and Company stuck to Civil War books written from a Northern perspective, mostly by U.S. generals. The nearly exclusive Northern focus did not result from the tastes of Charles L. Webster, though. He had to answer to the founder of the firm, his wife's uncle, whose pen name was Mark Twain. Mark Twain founded Webster and Company to publish himself, and he started with a bang, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in 1885. But it was the second book that Webster published that changed everything. It changed the fortunes of Webster and Company, and it changed the Civil War memory market, which watched as December 1885 and March 1886 launched in succession the 2 volumes of personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. And here we go. You don't have to worry. Subsequent quotations will come more rapidly, but here we go. This is Twain boasting. He's just got a big case of what Hemingway would call the braggies right here. He's bragging about how well Grant's book is done. And I'm not going to read all the stats, but sold 610,000 single volumes, average of $4 each, and then all these statistics about the materials it takes to publish this many books. You got sheep, goat, and calf skins. You've got all the barrels of paste. You've got the steam that has to be, and then these books are cranking out at a major rate. This is the sentence I want, the one in bold. By the time that the book had been issued or been out 14 months, we have thus far paid Mrs. Grant, who at this point is Grant's widow, 2 checks for royalties, one for $200,000 and the other for $150,000, and more is still due her. If you've been to the house in Hartford, you've seen one of these checks. It's in the billiard room. It's the check for $200,000. Now, I understand that may be small change to many people in this room, but let's do the conversion. In today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, Mark Twain paid Julia Grant the equivalent of $10 to $11 million in today's money. How many people in here have written a book? Yeah. Can you imagine? That's just, I feel good when the check rolls in for $100. Maybe goes to the groceries for a week. But $10 to $11 million. And what you have to realize is the tipsy side of this boasting aside, discounting that, this is a watershed moment in American publishing history, American Civil War history, and American cultural history, because what it shows us is the first time a personal memoir hit this kind of jackpot. The combination of the personal touch and the profitability. The most popular book in the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she Harriet Beecher Stowe way outsold Grant, but his book earned much more than she ever earned, mostly because of Mark Twain's business sense. And so now I want to talk about something that I'm going to call the Twain effect. The story of generals' narratives in the Civil War memory market must include some account of this, the Twain effect. The Twain effect appears most obviously in the cases of memoirs by the people he published, Grant, George B. McClellan, and Philip H. Sheridan. But it appears in other ways as well, as we shall see. For the moment, though, I want to ask a question, which is this. Why did Mark Twain's firm buck the post-war trend of publishing books from both sides? It may be that after he saw the success of Grant's memoirs, he hoped to build on it by building a series of his own to compete with Scribner's campaigns of the Civil War. If so, he could not have approached Robert E. Lee, who had died in 1870, and George McClellan and Philip Sheridan presented much better opportunities for commercial success, especially with veterans' membership in the Grand Army of the Republic, growing steadily through the 1880s towards its peak in 1890. But profit motive alone, I don't think, can explain why Twain stuck close to United States generals for 4 more books. He published a 3rd edition of Sherman's after Sherman's agreement with his original publisher went out of date. He also published books by Samuel Crawford, George Armstrong Custer, or about George Armstrong Custer, and William Winfield Scott Hancock, all 1887. And these last were okay, but they didn't do as well as the grant, and he could have made a whole lot more money, I'm betting, if he had approached some of the former Confederates. Edward Porter Alexander, John B. Gordon, Jubilee Early, James Longstreet, John Singleton Mosby. All of these people still had books to come. In approaching these former Confederates, Twain could have had the advantage of playing his fellow Southerner card. We know that he held this card in his hand. On February 11th, 1901, at Carnegie Hall, Mark Twain delivered introductory remarks at a benefit for the Lincoln Memorial University, established in 1897 in Harrogate, Tennessee, with the help of U.S. General Oliver Otis Howard. The event coincided with the celebration of Lincoln's 92nd birthday, and it's 7 years after Charles L. Webster and company went bust following the failure of Twain's investments in the Page typesetter. Now, here's how, I'm going to show you another quotation in a minute, but here's how Twain set this up. Twain's in Carnegie Hall talking to this benefit audience. He begins by saying, "I was born and reared in a slave state. My father was a slave owner. And in the Civil War, I was a 2nd lieutenant in the Confederate service." And then he paused in his best Artemus Ward style and added, "for a while." If you know the story, he lasted 2 weeks, and then he lit out for Nevada. The New York Times report of this evening says, after he says, "for a while," you know how they did that in the 19th century, there's a bracket, it says, "laughter," like that. Twain's brief Confederate service is well known to people who have read the little short piece, The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, 1885. Now, here comes some interesting stuff. More important for the moment is the movie made next. We of the South were not ashamed, for like the men of the North, we were fighting for flags we loved. And when men fight for these things and under these convictions, with nothing sordid to tarnish their cause, the cause is holy. The blood spilled for it sacred. The life that is laid down for it is consecrated. No Confederate memoirist, whether a general or not, could have waved the stainless banner more vigorously. Yet, by the end of his remarks, the always ever shape-shifting Twain was reassuring his audience he was not an unreconstructed rebel. He was a complete believer in reconciliation. And then it goes on, "The old wounds are healed, you and we are brothers again." And then I'll skip down to the part in bold. "We're laying our honest homage at the feet of Abraham Lincoln and forgetting that you of the North and we of the South were ever enemies, and remembering only that we are now indistinguishably fused together and nameable by one common great name, Americans." Had he solicited books from all those Confederates I named, Twain could have adjusted his mix of lost cause rhetoric with reconciliation rhetoric to suit a particular prospect. But he never approached any of them. And even more revealing, he doesn't seem to have read many books by Confederate writers or owned many books by Confederate writers. There are a few exceptions. He owned John Scott's Partisan Life with Colonel John S. Mosby, and there's a report in the journal of his secretary, Isabel Lyon, that he asked her to search for his copy of Recollections of Letters of General Robert E. Lee by his son, but she couldn't find it, and there's no record that he ever read it. For a self-proclaimed son of the lost cause, this is not an impressive record. It raises suspicion about the sincerity of Mark Twain's Confederate affiliation. That affiliation has the mark of a costume that he donned on this occasion of Lincoln's birthday. But whereas he could play Confederate when he needed to, by contrast, Mark Twain's loyalty to the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant was authentic and it was staunch. And this loyalty may account in part for the all-Union book list that followed. When he pursued Grant, persuading him to break off negotiations with the Century Company and sign a contract with him instead, his primary motive may have been mercenary on both his own behalf, and on behalf of Grant's, because, as you may know, by this point, Grant was broke. He had been swindled out of all his money by a Wall Street scam, and there were no pensions for former generals of the Army or former presidents. But after Grant died of cancer in July 1885, and after his posthumously published memoirs conquered the memory market, Mark Twain knew that Grant had given him more than money. He had given him a major work of American literature. And so here's my second thing. Now I'm interested in talking about what are these memoirs? Are they history? Are they literature? What's the deal here with these things? When speaking of Grant's personal memoirs, Twain often used the word literature or literary, and he never backed down from it. Here's the next one I'm going to show you. People may hunt out what microscopic motes they please, but after all, the fact remains and cannot be dislodged that General Grant's book is a great, and in its peculiar department, unique and unapproachable literary masterpiece. This was an after-dinner speech that Twain gave in 1887. It's almost as though, if by fiat, as if by command, Twain is saying, let there be American literature made from American memoir. It's as though he's inventing something right on the spot. This is another instance, I would say, of the Twain effect. In what way is Grant's book a literary masterpiece? Anyone searching for Grant's book in a library will find the book classified under the specific heading American History. Originating in the same part of the 19th century as the American Library Association, the American Historical Association, and the Civil War publishing boom, the library classification system of the Library of Congress was coming into being. Now, library classifications are like everything else. They have histories, and the history of library classifications goes back at least as far as the 3rd century BCE library at Alexandria. But I'm not going to take you back all that far. I'm going to take you to this person I have to talk about because he's Jefferson, and I come from the University of Virginia, and if you don't talk about Jefferson, they fire you. What this is, the germ of the Library of Congress was Jefferson's personal collection. That's what started the Library of Congress. And in 1815, Jefferson had published a catalog of all the books. He had about 6,000 books in his library. And here's his classification system. Books may be classed according to the faculties of the mind employed on them, that is, employed in generating them and employed in reading them. 1, there are books that come from memory, there are books that come from reason, there are books that come from imagination. So much for the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress numerical system. It's just one of these 3. What Jefferson then did is he then mapped each of these 3 onto the kind of literature produced, or the kind of writing to produce. So memory produces history, reason produces philosophy, imagination produces fine arts. At stake, who cares? Well, what's at stake in the classifying of books is nothing less than preparing us how to read them fully and how to read them well. Or you put it a different way, at stake in the classification of books is how to read them in a way that prepares us to receive the knowledge books have to give. You take personal memoirs of U.S. Grant, for example. Are they history? Are they literature? Do we assume that the faculty most important to the creation of these books is memory, or was it imagination? In all narratives, retired General-in-Chief Winfield Scott wrote in the introduction to his 1864 memoirs, In all narratives, the art of selecting, rejecting, and grouping incidents is one of difficult attainment, right? This is the former general of the Army before the war begins. The art of selecting, rejecting, and grouping incidents is one of difficult attainment. The art that Scott's describing here recalls the history of the word fiction, which does not just mean falsehood. It's derived from a Latin verb meaning to shape, to fashion, to form, or to mold. The question is, how do these books, these memoirs, mix the varnished and the unvarnished? How do they mix the fact and the fiction? Or the truth and the non-truth? How do they shape and mold? Thomas Jefferson's book classification scheme does not account for the enhancing contribution made by the imagination to memory. Memory and imagination are not opposites. They're not even wholly separate, despite the widespread tendency among many of us to associate memory with mental facts on file and imagination with mental inventions out of thin air. Both memory and imagination repeat or reproduce pre-existing mental pictures. Memory does not necessarily involve real things or events. One can remember a product of the imagination, such as a particularly vivid nightmare or a hallucination or a fantasy. Flip it over, conversely, imagination cannot operate without real things. You can't have a winged horse if you can't remember a wing and you can't remember a horse. It's from Mark Twain himself that one of the shrewdest statements about the imaginative nature of memory comes. Many of you probably know this one. For many years, I believed that I remembered helping my father drink his whiskey toddy when I was 6 weeks old. But I do not tell about that anymore now. I am grown old and my memory is not as active as it used to be. Then came the wily formation, couched in humor, is very much to the point. When I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it happened or not. But my faculties are decaying now, and soon I shall be, so I cannot remember anything but the latter. If a general officer wanted to reproduce his memories of the Civil War for readers by writing for them, buying books in the 70s and 80s, then imagination had to play a part in that reproduction, even if the general determined to tell nothing but the truth of real events as far as he could discern it. If we turn to Noah Webster's entry on imagination in his 1825 Dictionary of the American Language, we find a very illuminating moment among the examples of usage he gives for the term imagination. We would define imagination to be the will working on the materials of memory. Not satisfied with following the order prescribed by nature or suggested by accident, it selects, right? That's the same word that Winfield Scott used, selecting among things, the parts of different conceptions or objects of memory to form a whole more pleasing, more terrible, or more awful than has ever been presented in the ordinary course of nature. From this, it's a short step, a very short step, to linking the idea of imagination with the late 18th and early 19th century celebration of imagination we call Romanticism. Romanticism has many connotations that can make 21st century historians very nervous, especially those among them who insist history is a social science. You don't want to necessarily walk into a history department and say, you guys are all a bunch of romantics. At the same time, prominent literary histories of the United States have used 1865 to draw a really strict boundary between American Romanticism before the war and American realism after the war. So in other words, not only did Grant and Lee lay down their arms at Appomattox, but suddenly realism was born. This boundary makes discussion of Romanticism in relation to memoirs of the Civil War sound quaint or maybe obsolete, as though one were suffering from a lingering case of what Twain himself called Sir Walter disease, referring to the medieval romances of Sir Walter Scott and their deleterious influences on 19th century Southern writers in particular. But to try to explain the popularity of Civil War generals' memoirs in the late 19th century publishing market of the US without considering the legacy of Romanticism is to make a significant historical mistake. The mistake has to do with overlooking one of the richest legacies Romanticism bequeathed to 19th century memoirs. And that legacy is the rhetorical technology of the first-person narrative, or the first personal pronoun I. Now I'm at my last part. This is part 3. And this part is about audience expectations and using the first personal pronoun I. First-person narrative now is so pervasive, it's so naturalized by the contemporary market for memoir as the mode that we associate with telling candid stories about ourselves, that we can easily forget that the first person has a history of its own, and it hasn't always dominated. Here's one I like a lot. In most books, the I, or first person, is omitted. In this, it will be retained. That, in respect to egotism, is the main difference. This is Henry David Thoreau in the second paragraph of Walden, published in 1854, 20 years before Joe Johnston's narrative of military operations emerged. That Thoreau could say such a thing halfway through the 19th century shows how first-person narrative had not yet come into its kingdom, although it would by the end of the century. And then the rest, which I think is great. We commonly do not remember that it is, after all, always the first person that is speaking. I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. Sure, it's always the first person speaking, but the first person has not always spoken comfortably in the first person. In his Anabasis, 4th century BCE forerunner of American Civil War generals' memoirs, Xenophon referred to himself in the third person when narrating his march into Persia. Likewise, Julius Caesar wrote about himself in the third person in his 1st century BCE commentaries. In the learned introduction to his memoirs, Winfield Scott cited both of these people, Xenophon and Julius Caesar, and then went on to write much of his memoir, 1864, in the third person. In the US, the most visible among 18th century first-person precedents remains Ben Franklin's unfinished autobiography, written between 1771 and 1790. But it's a work published in French in 1782 that went well beyond Franklin. This work was The Confessions of J.J. Rousseau, which in an early manuscript added the subtitle, here we go, wait for it, containing the circumstances of the events of his life and his secret feeling in all situations in which he found himself. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's opening 2 sentences mark a significant development in the history of the first person, one with a more complex relation to moral improvement than that of Ben Franklin's autobiography. And here is this. We won't even talk about the modesty factor here. I am forming an undertaking which has no precedent, and the execution of which will have no imitator whatsoever. I wish to show my fellows a man in all the truth of nature, and that man will be myself. Rousseau's first-person undertaking anticipated many aspects of the romantic endeavor. In showing himself to others in all the truth of his nature, however, the Geneva-born thinker and writer revealed more than some people cared to see. Despite Rousseau's claim, there is nothing that has no precedent. Before Rousseau's confessions, there were confessions to God or to prophets in the Hebrew Bible, confessions to agents of the law, confessions under torture to torturers, confessions to priests in confessionals. In European writing, there were innovative precedents to Rousseau's confessions in the essays of Montaigne. Rousseau was also wrong in claiming that his undertaking would have no imitators. As it turns out, his imitators would fill Madison Square Garden. Among them, these imitators didn't necessarily know if they were imitating Rousseau sometimes, or perhaps an intermediary. Ralph Waldo Emerson read Rousseau. So did Walt Whitman in William Swinton's translation. In 1888, The same year that Mark Twain published Phil Sheridan's memoirs, Whitman reviewed his career in a backward glance and had this to say, sounding very much like Rousseau. Leaves of Grass has been chiefly the outcropping of my own emotional and personal nature, an attempt from first to last to put a person, a human being, myself, in the latter half of the 19th century in America, freely, fully, and truly on record. Rousseau's Confessions gave 19th century writers a model for more than the verbal workings of first-person narrative. It gave them a model for, or an imaginative precedent for what a first-person speaker might do with memory. You got a memory, you got the first person, put them together, what do you got? A writer coming after Rousseau did not have to reproduce his confessional frankness, of course. First-person narrative did not have to lead to making private things public. In the cases of Civil War generals who wrote their memories of the war, I am not assuming that writing in the first person necessarily caused them to indulge in sensational oversharing of private secrets. Grant never mentioned his drinking in all of his 2 volumes, although after Grant died, Twain commented in a letter that he thought he should have. William T. Sherman chose to strike from a manuscript he sent to his publisher a few lines about the history of insanity in his family. Probably a good thing. Richard Taylor never acknowledged that he swore in front of Stonewall Jackson. George B. McClellan voiced actual uncertainty about himself to his wife in private letters in his memoir. And Philip Sheridan also made it clear that he could swear and that he was insubordinate. These disclosures, hardly sensational confessions, fell well within the boundaries patrolled by respectable northern publishers, such as the Appletons and Mark Twain. What I do assume is that generals' memoirs classified by the Library of Congress as history depended on their authors' imaginations to combine the materials of memory with the materials furnished by history into new wholes of their own creation. In turn, these new wholes were reconstructions for their readers, and the double meaning here of reconstruction in the context of the Civil War general's book is noteworthy. In the end, what made these books important, and makes them important still, is this convergence of first-person storytelling with the most extensive violence yet visited in a compressed period of a few years on people living in the United States. No one aware of that violence, suffered firsthand, or witnessed from a distance could comprehend the whole of it. Each could know it only from an individual point of view. What made Civil War generals' memoirs of the 1870s and 1880s especially effective in the Civil War memory market was their innovative application of the personal to the impersonal, of private sensibility to public events. No Civil War general would have described his memoir in the same terms Whitman used. Can you imagine Grant saying, what I really want to do is put a person on record, that's me? No general would have said it, but you can bet that Mark Twain would have. And here is another side of the Twain effect. Twain knew the 19th century reading public, and he knew that by the 1880s, its tastes had been shaped by increasingly sophisticated first-person combinations of materials into new imaginative wholes. During the 1830s and 1840s, readers became familiar with Edgar Allan Poe's first-person narrators, many of them extravagantly unreliable. In 1847 came Charlotte Bronte's groundbreaking narrative experiment, Jane Eyre. The years 1849 to 50 and 1860 to 61 brought the serialization of 2 first-person masterworks by Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, which we know Grant read, and Great Expectations, which Sherman was rereading the day he died. By 1865, 105 slave narratives had appeared in North America, over half of them in the 1840s and 50s, and many of these narratives employed a first-person voice. And by the time that many readers came to generals' memoirs, they had before them the greatest fictional experiment in first-person vernacular narrative in the United States to date, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. the Twain effect once again. Without Mark Twain, things would have been very different. That's what I've been trying to say. Now, I'm winding up here. Here comes the end. Without the Civil War, there never would have been a Mark Twain. Evidence for this assertion comes from chapter 23 of his Life on the Mississippi, 1883. It's a mixed stew of a book containing, with much else, Twain's most extended version of a Civil War memoir. If you're interested in that aspect of that book, you see especially the chapters on Vicksburg and New Orleans. But the point of my talk this evening has been the exact reverse. True, without the Civil War, there would have been no Mark Twain. But without Mark Twain, the Civil War memory market would not have developed as it did. All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. That's a hyperbolic stretcher of the kind that Twain himself loved, and it's a statement by Ernest Hemingway that appears in Green Hills of Africa, 1935. Hemingway said, all American writing comes from that. There was nothing before, there has been nothing as good since. Not true. Not true, but it's useful. It's very useful. It's useful because it can serve us to remind us that all American writing comes from other writing. And that in the history of Civil War writing, Mark Twain stands for a moment when multiple factors converged to produce writing that still matters today, both for itself and for what else has come from it. Divisive and destructive as it was, and on many fronts still is, the Civil War meant advancement in several areas. It advanced the standing of many black Americans. It advanced the standing of many women. It advanced medical knowledge. It advanced the reach and capacity of the telegraph and the railroads. It advanced newspaper writing and photography. And it advanced American writing. It did not advance American writing simply by giving a new subject matter or new attitudes toward that subject matter, though it did that too. The Civil War advanced American writing by connecting disruptive public events to first-person memoirs on a scale never before seen. In doing so, it demonstrated something about the way American public memory was beginning to work in combination with personal imagination, as well as something about how Americans began to associate their absorption of public events, especially disruptive ones, with first-person memoirs circulated by publication markets. Now, since the late 19th century, other tributaries have been flowing into the changeable course of first-person narrative and memory. The 20th century gave us the rise of psychoanalysis, talk therapy, and of course that's played a big role in how people want to tell their stories. And in our century, the 21st century, technologies have emerged to exhibit and disseminate people's own words and images. You don't have to be a leading actor in public events to command a readership or an audience of hundreds, thousands, sometimes even millions. At the same time, it's become increasingly commonplace for leading actors in public events to proceed directly from those public events or public office or public service to lucrative contracts for first-person memoirs. Whatever your politics are, there's somebody that has come down through your politics and has published a memoir. This path, now so well worn, it suggests an inevitable movement from public event to public memory of the event shaped by the memoirs of leading actors has not always existed. It began with the Civil War memory market. Arguing that all American literature comes from Huckleberry Finn can't work. But arguing for the link between Civil War memoirs published in the late 19th century, among them those published by generals, and first-person memoirs published now on topics having nothing to do with the Civil War, memoirs by famous people and not so famous people, can work. No one did more to make that link possible while making it profitable than Mark Twain did. Thank you. Yeah.